I tried out the new units in the 4.2 Novaflare and oh boy were the results absolutely shocking. So for this current rotation with Firefly, Huohuo, Seele as well, we have some very impactful buffs, some of the biggest we have ever since Kafka's upgrade to DOT, as well as Sparkle's return to Tier 0. So hey guys, MrPokke here, and we are going to be taking a look at each individual unit for their Novaflare, what their buffs do, the impact of said buffs, how to utilize them, as well as an overall rating and summary for their respective Novaflare. So without further ado, bada boom, bada bing, bada bang. Alright, starting right off the get-go, and that is gonna be pretty much, in my opinion, the strongest unit as of right now in terms of meta. Not really so much in terms of the buff changes, but just how good this unit actually is, and that is going to be Firefly. We have 4 different buffs, 3 for E0, 1 for E2, overall a extremely nice upgrade. Essentially, Firefly got a absolutely massive raw damage multiplier increase, more than 50% final damage increase at E0, and even higher at E2. Pretty much the strongest DPS buff of all of the 4 units so far, which is pretty ironic considering that we literally just got Dahlia, so I don't even know which other version 2 units have like this amount of treatment, but that's gonna be them, right? So for the skill, you are now gonna be adding the fire weakness to the adjacent targets as well, lasting for 2 turns. Overall, it's gonna be a 7 out of 10. Good for some scenarios, but it's not gonna be too useful in others. The damage multiplier is pretty much gonna be the exact same, with the additional effect of adding the 2 fire weakness to the adjacent targets. I would say this is gonna be very helpful in multi-target content, namely pure fiction or bosses with mob summons, not on fire weakness. For example, the Juvenile's team, I think this is one of the most common enemies you're probably going to be using against Firefly, because the summons only have quantum and imaginary weakness, so Firefly's added fire implant is going to be extremely nice over here. Now on top of that, not only does this help Firefly break the enemies faster, it also helps Dahlia as well as Fuchs attack, such as Dahlia's follow-up attack, Dahlia's skill, and Fuchs enhanced basic, improving the overall toughness bar damage to other targets. But I would say because of this added fire weakness, you kind of want to try to be mindful, because you still want to try and make sure that Firefly is going to be the one breaking the enemies, especially if you have her E2. So I would say this is going to be a generally pretty decent quality of life, not too useful if the enemies already have fire weakness, and is really good if the mobs as well as adjacent targets does not have it. Now for the first trace to get an upgrade, we are essentially going to be increasing the break effect by 25%, as well as extending the combustion countdown by 10% of action value up to 3 times during the combustion state. I would say overall this is going to be a 3 out of 10 rating, changes pretty much almost nothing, especially if you really have Dahlia, which pretty much every single Firefly main would have as of this current moment. So taking the fixed SAM speed at 70 base speed, your usual ultimate action value will last for roughly 143 action value, which is going to be seen from this formula over here. With the added 10% action value delay up to 3 times, this will last roughly to 186 action value. The form can be seen over here. So as such, the additional 30% AV actually gives you roughly 40 actual AV boost, because the fixed speed is going to be 70, which is also why when you play units in HSR, DDD will give you more action value for units with slower speed, but don't worry about this over here. While this might seem pretty good, unfortunately, Dahlia already completely fixes Firefly's ultimate downtime, because we pretty much can cast our skill and enter the ultimate immediately without really caring too much if the ultimate state is going to be extending. So it doesn't really matter if Firefly leaves the combustion mode, especially if you can just immediately cast it again. In fact, sometimes you ironically want Firefly to leave the mode slightly earlier, so that you can get one more normal skill as the additional toughness bar damage before proccing your ultimate again, because more toughness bar damage is always going to be better. On top of that, this AV extend, it is going to be useless in AV reset scenarios, specifically in Memory of Chaos, but it does work in pure fiction, A4 as well as anomaly arbitration. So for example, if you cast your ultimate in wave 1, break 3 times, and go into the next wave after your ultimate in MOC, it will return back into a 143 AV delay, and you cannot get additional delays anymore because it already broke 3 times. So from a 0 cycle perspective, this is also going to be pretty much changing absolutely nothing by the time you reach into wave 2. By the end of everything, 25% break effect is always going to be 25% break effect, so yippee! Now moving on to Firefly's next trace upgrade, which is pretty much going to be one of the most impactful changes, basically bring our super break damage multiplier all the way up to 150% if you have 300 break effect. Overall, I would say this is going to be the most important change for Firefly at E0, E2, and whatever it's going to be, at a whopping 9 out of 10 rating. This is pretty much going to be the most substantial buff, essentially tripling the old additional super break damage multiplier from 50% at 360% break effect to 150% at 300 break effect. So when it comes to the final damage, this was more than a 50% final damage increase running full E0 as well, as you can see from this setup over here. So regarding why this buff is so substantial, it will also kind of depend on your teammates. So assuming you're going to be running a full E0 Dahlia with Fuke, the old super break multiplier was going to be 50 plus 100 plus 60, coming 210% super break. The added 100% super break multiplier will bring this to 310% or roughly a 48% higher super break damage multiplier overall, which led to the final damage increase being around that ballpark. It's going to be slightly higher over here because of defense down sources. So if you have an E1 Dahlia, this will actually bring the buff down to a little bit lower to 40% because the more super break multipliers you have, the less impactful this is actually going to be. So with that being established on that note, HMC used to be really strong because we didn't really have a lot of super break multipliers to begin with, since Firefly was only going to be at 50%. Now, because of this 150% multiplier, the SB multiplier from HMC is actually going to come down to roughly 140% on average, depending on the number of targets you're going to be hitting. So before the buff, this 140% was roughly a 56% super break damage increase, but after this buff, this is going to go down slightly to 40%. As such, unless you need the additional S5 DDD spam with HMC, you could consider E1 Rame or even E1 Tribute to be a better slot for sustainers for your Firefly DPS. But with that being established, for most zero cycle scenarios, because the power of DDD is just going to be so impactful, I think HMC will still find a decent amount of value, and it's not that the super break multiplier is going to be useless, it's just going to be slightly less impactful. And then for the final change for Firefly, and that's going to be Bros E2, essentially there's no more cooldown. That is pretty much it. I would say for E2 Firefly means this is pretty much going to be a 9 out of 10, -1 for not having a guaranteed trigger, and you cannot actually bring forward to the next wave. So I would say this almost changes everything, because theoretically speaking, it would be a 50% final damage increase on top of whatever we have right now, as long as you can guarantee 2 consecutive turns on E2 every single turn. That being said, the trigger condition while having the cooldown removed does not have the condition changed, which means that you have to guarantee either a break or a kill with Firefly every single turn. Also, this E2 that I mentioned does not carry forward to the next wave. So if you kill or break something in wave 1, no extra turn will be triggered on wave 2, so there's going to be no changes from the base E2 from last time. So on my past experiences running Firefly on live server as well as an early access, I would say in practice, this will not really have a 100% uptime, maybe closer to 75% or maybe 80% for MOC, APOL, and anomaly arbitration, especially if the bosses have extremely high toughness and no mob summons. So you likely cannot guarantee this every single time. But the biggest upgrade for this, especially with the added Fire Witness implant, is more so for modes like Pure Fiction, where E2 Firefly might actually be a tier 0 DPS for Super Breakers because of pretty much unlimited extra turns every single time you cast your skill. So even on full auto, I would say because of this upgrade, you are not really going to be seeing any other close competitions for other break DPS, so that'll be girlfriend. In any case, for the times that you do get extra proc, this increase can be said to be a direct 50% damage increase over the old E2 from once every other turn to once every single turn, assuming you can actually proc them. So with that, we've pretty much come to the end of our Firefly analysis. In summary, average rating is going to be exactly at 7 out of 10, substantial damage improvements in E0, even better upgrade at E2, as well as the combustion mode extension didn't really change too much, but the damage upgrade is still going to be very nice. For your build, it's going to be relatively unchanged, 4-piece Iron Cavalry into 2-piece Calvagini, and then signature light cone over your 4th Aeon. For our teammates, experiment slot 4 with either Sustain Lingsha or Sustainless HMC, Rame or E1 Tribi, but Fugue and that is pretty much going to be non-negotiable. And then for the cost upgrades, I would still prioritize E2 Firefly over any other cost, especially with the brand new buff. Then if you have any other cost to spare, you could consider getting an E1 Dahlia. Now move on to the next unit, and that is going to be pretty much the unit I've been slandering for almost every single day for the past 2 years, none other than Huohuo, or Huohuo. So Huohuo is actually going to be getting 4 buffs, 3 for E0 and 1 for E1. They're a little bit similar to Firefly, but the upgrades are mainly going to be focusing on improving Huohuo's sustain. The objective of this upgrade was to basically improve the sustain, but the overall utility remains relatively unchanged, which is why her ultimate is pretty much still going to be 20% max energy and the 40% attack buff, although the attack buff got a little bit of a buff itself. So for the talent, the main change is basically this thing will last for 3 turns, as well as a higher amount of healing multiplier when I'm going to be comparing this to the older version. So I would say this is pretty much going to be a roughly 8 out of 10. It improves your overall sustain and skill point economy, but there is one catch which I'll explain a little bit later. But I just want to take this moment. after my non-stop Huohuo slander for the past 2 years, it seems that HSR devs is finally listen, and I kind of feel vindicated because every single day I've been complaining that Huohuo doesn't sustain, Huohuo doesn't sustain, and y'all be acting like, oh my god, bro, he doesn't know how to play the game, he's the on... Well, bro, it ain't what to do, right? So now you do get access to even more heals as well as refreshing your divine protection on the ultimate while maintaining the bars for 3 turns instead of 2, which was previously tied to her E1. But now, while this additional heal for the ally with the lowest HP made her sustain a lot more comfortable, but it is not gonna be as perfect because sometimes if the enemies wants to one-shot you, especially you can see from this specific screenshot over here, like consecutive turns from the enemy target, they will still one-shot you. So you can see my Spark Seek was like literally down to the last 9 HP and there was pretty much nothing I can do about it because I have no ultimate, no way to catch this. It is what it is, right? So this is pretty much the only gripe I have with the Trace, which is while it can help you in scenarios that previously was like, you know, leaving you at roughly maybe less than 1000 HP, and then now it's gonna be at a very comfortable like 1.5k HP. If you're gonna be still facing very high sustained pressure for a single target burst, Huohuo will still fundamentally lack this one-shot attack prevention tool compared to, let's just say for example, a preservation sustain like DHPT, unless you intentionally hold an ultimate on your teammates. So although the healing for Huohuo does increase, you might not always have the ultimate available if you're going to be chasing damage. So when you're going to be playing Huohuo, especially on full auto, you just need to be a little bit more aware when using her so that you can at least hit the ultimate if you know and you expect a very big attack coming to your team's way. Now, the trigger count is going to be refreshed at every single turn between the skill and ultimate, so you don't really have to worry about running out of 6 stats whatsoever. One thing to consider is that there is going to be a 1-turn buff upgrade for your talent, but Huohuo actually uses a skill very freely given the current landscape with Silver 9, or even with DOT if you want to get her ultimate faster, so long as you do have the skill point to spare. So this 1-turn upgrade is not going to be super significant as compared to the actual healing, hence this is going to be a roughly 8 out of 10. And then for a Trace one, you're going to be getting 30 additional energy as well as the Divine Provision for 2 turns. Pretty much going to be allowing Huohuo to get an instant ultimate on the first base attack with an energy regeneration light cone, so it could be S1 or the Post of Conversation, as well as a 2-piece planar 5%. Compared to the old Huohuo, having the ability to cast your ultimate instantly can change a lot of rotations and playstyles, a key example being Silver 9's team, where Huohuo can enable EMC to kick her ultimate, and EMC's ultimate will then give Silver 9 her ultimate, especially for an E0 Silver 9. Now, though you can get instant ultimates with Huohuo, you might actually save this if your teammates generate enough energy to cast the spells right after that skill, which can actually give you a little bit more energy regeneration because you're comparing roughly like 30-ish or maybe 35 energy to a 20% of the unit's max energy, so it will depend on the units that Huohuo is actually going to be buffing. That being said, the attack buff is still going to be a nice damage increase, especially when combined with the Trace tool's 24% additional attack for 160 energy and buffs, so generally speaking, unless your ultimate is almost close to the cap, you can just cast this every single time. And speaking about the 24% additional attack buff, that's going to be the Trace tool, which will increase your chance to resist crowd control, as well as increasing a target's attack by 24% if the energy is more than 160. This is gonna be a roughly 4 out of 10 rating for buff. It does give you 24% more attack, but 160 energy is a really restrictive criteria, namely, especially for the current best install, you're probably gonna be running Huohuo with the DOT teams, where none of the DOT ultimates actually have 160 energy. So nobody can make use of this. This is gonna be a pretty big bummer because objectively speaking, as of right now, Huohuo is gonna be having the best sustain as of this moment, aside from DHPT for your DOT. And likely speaking, even though you can use Huohuo in Elation teams, she's probably going to be moving out from the Elation team when the Elation sustain is going to be coming along to get together with Evanesia alongside Sparksea, Yaoguang, as well as Silver Knight. So this attack increase is pretty much also useless for high energy units, but unfortunately scale on HP. For example, Maide with the exact 160 energy, or Elation units with enough attack to hit their Elation percentage, which is pretty much going to be useless or no Elation percentage at all. So realistically speaking, the units that can make use of this ultimate, or rather this trace, is going to be Saber, Archer, Yunli, Argenti, and Sparksea at the moment, potentially maybe even Nisia. Now, out of those 6 units, Archer, Sparksea sees the most impact, but the effect is just really minor and it should not be a priority to really care about that much. On top of that, EMC technically also counts as this, but the attack percentage on EMC is like a really minor upgrade, so that's pretty much going to be it. And then for the final Huohuo buff, and that's going to be the E1, you still keep the additional extend 1 turn for the talent, so you're now going to be getting 4 turns instead of the 3 turns previously. And on top of that, you have a 20% outgoing healing, which pretty much just gives you a little bit more heals that's it, right? 7 out of 10 rating, relatively okay for an E1 upgrade, but the main use of our E1 is actually still unchanged, and that is gonna be the 12% speed buff, which if you maintain this 12% speed buff, it is gonna be helping you hit a lot of speed thresholds because it will be up in the battlefield permanently the moment you enter, because you always start off with Huohuo's technique, or rather the talent, so this is pretty much gonna be permanent throughout the entire fight. The 20% outgoing healing, it will matter if you face higher pressure scenarios, and if you're still gonna be facing any problems with sustain, then this 20% is definitely gonna be useful over here. So in summary, Huohuo now have an average rating of 6.75 out of 10, substantial healing improvements at E0, E1 makes the heal a little bit stronger as well. The turn 1 ultimate is gonna be what guarantees us the faster rotation in combat, however, there's still no one-shot prevention, which means that players need to be a little bit more aware of upcoming enemy attacks and try to at least conserve an ultimate for an emergency heal if you know the attack is gonna be coming. So for the builds, it's also gonna be unchanged, 4-piece warrior or 2+2 speed, 2-piece Vonway or Lushaga, plus S1 or the post-op conversation. You could also consider Quick Protocol, but I personally don't really run it. And for the teammate, she is the current best in slot sustain for Elation Flagship. Otherwise, you can use her in DOT, for Archer, for Yuingli and Saber. All these are going to be pretty decent as well. And then for the cost upgrade, E1 is going to be more important than the S1, especially because post-op conversation is such a comfortable counter icon for abundance units. Now, moving on to our second last unit, and that is going to be Seele. 7 buffs, some minor, some major, but very, very nice changes overall to her kit. I just want to say, out of every single unit in Honkai Star Rail, Seele has one of, if not the highest manual gameplay difference due to your resurgence timing, and hence, her Novaflare actually does not change this whatsoever, so I will only recommend players to try using Seele if they are okay with non-auto gameplay, especially if you're going to be so used to the auto button. So if that being established, for the skill, you're going to be getting the additional skill damage multiplier to 260%, as well as automatically triggering this skill one time as long as the target's HP is below 50%. This can refresh every single time on Seele's turn. So I would say this is going to be a 9 out of 10 upgrade in almost perfection for Seele's kit, because on top of the 140% multiplier buff, you also get this free skill for every single enemy, and you can proc Resurgence on this skill. Unfortunately, you can't get the energy, but you also don't consume skill points, which is going to be the trade-off. So I would say this is going to be pretty decent for content like Pure Fiction, especially if you can deal AoE damage from the rest of the team, like for example E1 Tribute as well as Hyacinth. But the best part is that it can continuously trigger even on bosses, as long as their HP is below 50%. As such, this particular skill is going to be a little bit environment dependent, because if you do not have any mobs whatsoever and only have the boss, then the utility for Seele is not going to be that high, and you don't really want to use Seele in a scenario with no mobs anyways, because you really want to try to proc the Resurgence as much as possible. So one very important thing to note over here for this free skill is that it does in fact work with Saridra. So this will pretty much make Saridra one of the definitive best in slot teammate for Seele, because once at 50% and below for a boss, a single Seele skill will always proc twice every single turn, which will then feed into Saridra's charge stacking, which means that you can proc the Saridra double skill even faster with Seele. And then also on that note, if Seele can get off 3 skills or more due to your Resurgence, it also allows Sparkle's next skill to cost 0 skill point, which is also going to be a pretty nice upgrade. So I would say for the current synergy, Seele plus Saridra plus Sparkle is going to be looking like a very, very nice team, although you can also use other units like Sunday, RMC, and any sort of hyper carry support, just like a hyper carry. Now for the ultimate, it is a very, very straightforward multiplier increase. So it now deals 720% multiplier, which is going to be a pretty decent chunk of change from 425 to 720. Overall, 7 out of 10 increase. Now considering that Seele does in fact get Resurgence more frequently, as well as the use of Saridra and Huohuo, the ultimate for Seele should be a relatively almost consistent 3-turn ultimate, if not even shorter, with your additional kills. So it is definitely going to be possible to even cast 2 ultimates back to back with enough Resurgence as well as Saridra skill dupes, so definitely a very, very nice damage increase. And then for the talent, it's just going to be extending this particular 80% buff to 3 turns instead, 7 out of 10 rating. Most of the time, you will be facing a little bit of a downtime since it's almost impossible to trigger Resurgence every other turn. So this 80% buff becomes more or less a permanent upgrade, and you won't really have to worry about this falling off whatsoever. And then for the technique, you will gain this additional skill damage multiplied to a random enemy one time, as well as being a guaranteed crit. Free crit. But that being said, it is still going to be 4 out of 10 because this 1 damage, it is going to be on a random target. So ideally, in a practice scenario, you do want to try to land this on a mob so they can proc your resurgence a little bit faster, since the mob is going to be having a lower HP. Lower HP means closer to 50%, and then at 50% you get a double skill, so that is pretty much it. Then moving on to Scylla's Trace 1 change, it is gonna give you a 50% damage increase up to 3 times and lasting for 3 turns. So on paper, this could be a 150% damage buff, but it is gonna be at a 6 out of 10. So this does stack on very nicely with the 80% buff from Resurgence, so that will be a 230% damage buff, which is kind of bonkers. But the issue is, you need to kill 3 different targets. Not proc Resurgence, you have to defeat an enemy target, alright? So because of that, you might face a little bit of a difficulty to maintain this 150% buff upgrade throughout the entire battle. They would have made this a lot better if it's just simply from like the amount of time to cast the skill, which actually might be a little bit too crazy, but because the condition for this to trigger is only from an enemy defeat, realistically speaking, you're probably gonna be at best getting 100% on average, because this buff pretty much just have a 3-turn cooldown. Now keep in mind that Scylla really wants to get a kills for both Resurgence as well as this damage buff, which will make sense for Scylla's kit, but in practice, this might actually indirectly lower your DPS against the boss, because you're kind of forced to try and go ahead and kill the other mobs, and if there are no mobs, then you basically lose access to this Resurgence in the first place, so it's a little bit of a contradiction on do you target the boss or do you want to target the mobs, which is also why I say Scylla on manual gameplay is going to be a lot better than on auto. Now, moving on to Scylla's Idolin change, first of which being the E1, you get the additional 20% defense ignore, a pretty decent 6 out of 10 increase, especially a defense down on a Quantum DPS, because Quantum does have the 4-piece Quantum, Sylph has a lot of defense down, Sparkle has it at the E2 as well as the E4 trippy, so that's pretty much it. Now, while this is only gonna be at 80% HP and below, it does mean that it will guarantee a trigger every single time a minion is gonna be hitting 50% due to the free skill proc having pretty much 0 cooldown, right? Which means Scylla will get a lot of value over time with the added crit rate as well as defense down. So with 4-piece Quantum and units like a normal Sylph plus a Cypher or a Cypher signature Light Cone, you can easily hit 100% defense down or at least come up very close to it. But I do want to say at this point, I am definitely going to be biased over here because I wanted to give this a higher point, maybe like an 8 out of 10 or maybe even an 8.5. But oh my god, I absolutely hate the 85% crit rate criteria. Looking good? What the fuck? Hey, MrPokke, fix your because you're going to be getting 50% crit rate in battle. So you can see like in HSR, not having 100% crit means that if you miss that crit at that one point, it's just going to be extremely annoying. So if you were to build your 85% crit rate off battle and you miss on any enemy above 80% HP, that is going to be a huge DPS loss because you're potentially going to be taking 2 actions instead of 1 to one-shot or maybe come close to one-shot an enemy monster. However, if you do not give her the 85% crit rate and you just go all in on 100% crit rate, you are pretty much going to be wasting 30 crit value, right? So if only they made this like some kind of like a rest pen or like a damage penetration or like a damage buff or like a crit damage buff even, that would have made this way better. I just hate the idea that sometimes you're just gonna miss your crit rate, right? So that's gonna be that. And then one last changes to Scylla, and that's gonna be her E6. So for Scylla's E6, you are essentially gonna be getting a pretty substantial change. You are gonna be dealing true damage of 30% of the ultimate damage now instead of the previous multiplier, as well as the fact that anytime the target gets defeated when they take damage from this Scylla's true damage, you can actually proc Resurgence now. So I would say this is gonna be a 7 out of 10 upgrade. For the few E6 Scylla mains, you can rejoice, but I would say for an E6, this is extremely expensive, and I would not recommend anyone going all in for a Scylla banner just for this E6. If this was like an E1, I think it would be like an easily 8.5 or even 9 out of 10, but it is gonna be an E6. So I would say though, this Scylla's E6, it used to be one of the worst E6 in the entire game because you cannot even proc Resurgence off of the ultimate talent, which makes it almost completely useless even if you get the 15% ultimate damage multiplier. Now, you can actually get Resurgence when any unit procs this, and the ultimate damage is now a 30% true damage, which is a substantial buff, especially for multi-hits like Tribby, Car, as well as Silverwolf. But that being said, this E6 has a little bit of a problem, which is the allies needs to hit this target, which means the damage for your E6 is going to be slightly backloaded, and you cannot transfer between waves or even targets because it is basically a debuff. So because it is a single target debuff, the additional skill procs on other targets, if you were to bring it down to less than 50%, it will actually not trigger. So for a version 1 E6, it could be even better, but it is pretty much as good as it gets because, you know, at the end of the day, compared to previous E6, it is gonna be a pretty nice upgrade. So in summary, for Seele's buff, it's gonna be an average rating of 6.5 out of 10, but frankly speaking, this could be a little bit higher, maybe leaning towards like 6.75 or maybe 7, but I just really do not like the E1, so it is what it is. The biggest change for Seele is definitely gonna be the free skill proc on every single enemy at 50% HP, so I can see a lot of new use cases for Seele on pure fictions or enemies like Nikador, as well as true sting with the summons, so I'll be looking forward to some of the showcases in the future. Now, while I do think that Seele can definitely see some very fun showcase and plays, most of the time, I don't really see her competing close to the big four at the current moment, which is going to be Elation, Remembrance Blade, Excel's DOT at the similar cost investments. Alright, if you're going to be in the leaders to go for a sustainers clear, absolutely viable, but it's just not very realistic to expect it from the casual population. So for the builds for Seele, it's going to be pretty much unchanged. 4-piece Quantum into 2-piece Root and Arena or Glamorph, exactly the same. For the teammates, it is pretty flexible for a hypercarry setup. Cerebral is still going to be by far the best attack DPS that wants to use multiple skills, so definitely going to be non-negotiable. Then the third slot, you can either run Sparkle, Silver Wolf, 3B, Cypher, Bronya, Sunday, RMC, any of the above, although I personally do prefer Sparkle, especially if you have an E2 Sparkle for the defense down penetration. And then for the very last for a sustain, either run Huohuo or DHPT. Then for the cost upgrades, E1 is pretty decent for the 20% defense down, but I would say out of everything, Seele's E4 is still going to be the strongest E4, even for a version 1 unit, and it can now actually have even higher value because of the free skills having more potential to kill the targets, which means you have more potential to generate even more energy for your ultimate. Now, finally, we're going to come into the Kobe of Novaflare, Mr. Welt. We do have 9 different buffs and changes. Absolutely insane change for a unit. So at this point, for Welt's Novaflare, you are pretty much able to play him as both a support/sustain and a main DPS, especially at higher item investments. Now, in my humble opinion, this is pretty much the king of Novaflare, because bro's kit is completely changed and very likely is going to be at least tier 0.5 as a support and maybe even a main DPS with enough item investments. Unfortunately, I would say bro is going to be slightly held back by his teammates because most meta units don't really run nihility debuffers, namely Remembrance, Elation, Break, Archer, follow-up attack, DOT, and the only one that really uses Welt is pretty much just going to be Aggron by itself, which has questionable damage in the meta, right? So he does have very, very good buffs, but it's going to be at the wrong timing. Now, you could make the argument that Welt could be used sustainers for some specific teams. For example, the current Elation setup, you could actually run a sustainers Welt, but because I want to look forward more into the future, there really isn't too much sense into, like, let's just say, invest in the Welt, when in the future, you are probably going to be investing in either Elation Sustain or maybe another Elation Sirening. So that's pretty much going to be my opinion. I genuinely do believe, however, that E6 Welt is almost, if not better, DPS compared to an E6 Aggron, but I will save that for the live server to showcase you guys in the future, right? So for Welt skill buff, you're going to be getting this bounce 4 additional times instead of 2, which means that a single skill now can bounce 5 times, which is going to be really, really insane because previously this was tied to bro's E6 and now this E6 is going to be tied to your base kit. So this 5 times it will give you a very, very good amount of 360% damage multiplier, but because of the way that Welt's trace works later on, you actually get a 100% multiplier increase if the target is going to be slow. So if you apply this by 5 times, you are actually going to be getting a absolutely massive 860% damage multiplier, which is ridiculous for a free unit, right? But I would say it is not going to be as obvious as a buff if you're going to be using it as a debuff or a sub DPS, especially because he does consume a ridiculous amount of skill points if you're not going to be running Sparkle. But for the main DPS, this skill entitles more damage alongside the rest of the kit, thus allowing you to do very, very good damage. On top of that, despite the low base chance to apply a speed debuff, since you do get 5 bounces now and as such 5 chance to proc your speed debuff, even a low EHR Welt build with a crit rate chest or a crit damage chest can still more or less apply the speed down consistently. Now, moving on to the ultimate, you're going to be getting a little bit of a structural change, but fundamentally, this ultimate still works very similar to the previous ultimate. So I would say it's going to be 5 out of 10. Not that big of a difference, just changing the wording to apply weightless. And the weightless is the key part that will actually allow Welt to basically transcend towards like tier 0 in terms of a Novaflare, right? So I would say the base effect is going to be almost the exact same because the old version had a 40% action value delay. So now it is going to be 44%. And it does take time for your units to hit the target to slowly stack on to 44%. So because this caps at 8 times per target per turn, you can't actually have infinite turns, otherwise that will be absolutely tier 0 territory. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that weightless is not classified as a crowd control debuff, so less enemies will actually have hard resistance against weightless itself. So on that point regarding his ultimate, remember that for Welt's E2, you also gain 3 energy when the talent procs. So if you are going to be proccing your talent 5 times on skill, then it's going to be a theoretical 15 energy, which is also affected by your energy regeneration. So his ultimate uptime is pretty much going to be consistently at 2 turns with energy regeneration, if not maybe even 1 turn with external energy sources. So with a specific E2 Welt, every single skill will give you 53.7 energy, assuming you have 5 talent procs as well as energy regeneration rope. And with the ultimate restoring 5 energy as well as a 3 from the talent, you will basically exactly get 122.9 energy, guaranteeing a 2-turn ultimate every single time. If you are not going to be running well as a main DPS and you cannot run his skill every single time, you might want to consider running a tutorial S5 for a sub DPS to do a basic plus skill to be skill point neutral and leave the skill points for your main DPS. Then moving on to the talent, and that is pretty much gonna be, I think this is the only 10 out of 10 rating I've given in the entire list. So, absolute cinema. Now, enemy with weightless will have a 40% defense reduction, as well as a 5% speed decrease on top of the additional 100% multiplier when you're gonna be attacking the enemy. This attack will include your basic, skill, and ultimate. So, there is a lot of numbers to see over here on the screen, but first of all, the defense down. I would say 40% defense down, no questions asked. It is, just really high in terms of damage amplification, so you can actually run a tutorial Welt for even more energy regen, or slap on Acheron's S1 and see main DPS Welt go kinda crazy. If you want to gain even more defense down, you can also consider Cypher's S1 or even the good old classic Resolution S5. Now regarding this 100% imaginary damage proccing on a slow, so from this little picture over here, my eyes are probably failing me, I'm getting way too old. I tried my best and I think I count 7 different crits, but I would say the reason why we didn't see 10 different instances of damage instead of because if you were to proc skill 5 times and get 5 instances, that's gonna be 10, right? But I do believe it is because your very first 1 or maybe 2 hits did not actually get off the speed debuff, because this will only proc when the enemy has the speed debuff applied by your skill. So if it does actually get a speed debuff in cast skill, it will be a 860% damage multiplier on a skill on a standard unit, which is absolutely insane considering that Scylla's ultimate is 720%. Crazy. The additional 5% speed down now makes the total speed down from Welt a 25% speed down, and regarding this particular point, it might actually be counterintuitive in some scenarios because you want the enemies to take turns and hit you for energy regeneration, particularly for elation units like King Pom Pom to give you punchlines, so it is not always good. But on the flip side, if you want to run a sustainless Welt and you use Welt as a sustain to delay the enemies, then this is going to be an incredibly good trace to basically not allow them to take action for as long as possible, preventing your team from taking damage. And as I mentioned, the additional 100% multiplier applies to every single attack, so basic skill ultimate all get this for free. Now moving on to the trace one, you will get this additional damage percentage increase, stacking out to 10 times, lasting for 2 turns, as well as regenerating 30 energy. I'll give this a very solid 8 out of 10. Because from the wording, you will pretty much get a 100% damage increase for any ally, which makes Welt Yang a really good sub DPS or main DPS. Now keep in mind, this additional buff, it will be classified as a buff itself and not a debuff. So even if the main target with weightless dies, the buff will still stay on your DPS, even if the target is going to be changing or you're going to be going for different waves. So you are going to be getting almost essentially a 100% uptime because weightless can be easily applied with Welt's 2-turn ultimate. That being said, this is only going to be for an individual unit, so units that do not attack the target will not get this. For example, if you're going to be using Welt with Sparkle. And then the additional 30 energy essentially guarantees Welt to have a turn 1 ultimate, pushing back the enemies and opens up the sustainless Welt angle. Then moving on to the trace 2, when Welt deals the additional damage, it will give you an 80% base attack multiplier for your basic, as well as a 120% skill damage multiplier for your skill. This is going to be a roughly 7 out of 10, is a pretty okay damage increase for a main DPS, but it does not count as toughness bar, so all of the additional damage you have seen just now, it all just counts as damage, so no toughness damage whatsoever. 120% of the skill damage multiplier actually translates into 86.4, because the skill multiplier is going to be at 72, so it is not going to be as crazy as a 10 because this can only trigger 1 extra time over here. And then for Welt's last trace change, and that is going to be the EH Arch, which gives you up to 80% attack, and using ultimate gives you another 5 energy. Overall, a 3 out of 10 change, because generally speaking, for sub DPS running EHR main stat to apply your defense down, this is pretty okay for an 80% attack buff, but you never really need 80% EHR to begin with, since 67% will give you the 100% base chance on all 40 res enemies. And realistically, this is also going to be slightly overkill, but as a sub DPS, your damage is already kind of mediocre, especially in aggron teams where you cannot really run enough skill points. So Sparkle is going to constantly buff Aircron, and your Welt is pretty much going to be homeless except for Sparkle's ultimate. You could consider running an E1 Tribute and get speed boost for Aircron for faster stacks, which may indirectly lower Aircron's ultimate damage. For a main DPS Welt, you will still prefer running crit rate on the chest, so this trait is going to be largely useless. Focus on getting more buffs on support and watch him basically just destroy the enemies with a crit damage. Now, moving on into Welt's Idolin, the first Idolin being an additional damage equals to 40% of the damage multiplier from your ultimate once per attack. So this is going to be a 6 out of 10. It is pretty much going to be a 150% base for ultimate, so a 60% damage multiplier. Alright, increase, 6 out of 10, 60%, not too much to say over here. I did not mention this in the change because it's going to be the exact same, but the E2 trace for the 3 energy is absolutely massive because they did buff your normal skill now to bounce 5 times at the base kit. So 15 energy, multiply energy regeneration, crazy. And then for Welt's E4. This is going to be the second 10 out of 10 buff that I've given to a Novaflare unit, and both 10 out of 10s, they are pretty much dominated by Welt himself. A all-type res pen by 30%. 3-0. As long as you have the Whaler state, which is pretty much permanent. So I would objectively say Welt Yang, as of this moment, has the best E4 in the entirety of Honkai style. Between standard units, DPS, limited, support, and whatever it's going to be, 30% res down on an E4 is absolutely ridiculous. Just purely from the raw values alone, it's just going to be really, really high. But that being said, even though this E4 is incredibly good, and right, you want to run a support well, right, a lot of the value does in fact come from this 30% res down. But because it is still going to be an E4, you do want to manage your pools carefully for the old Welt mains, bless you, right, and also Welt Yang was like my first E6, so W MrPokke, but I would not chase an E4 for a standard unit, and I'll just slowly play HSR, and if I were to lose my 50-50 to Welt Yang, fantastic, I get an E4. If I do not lose, I would never ever spend my golden spirits just for a standard Welt Yang, right? That is just going to be way too valuable, so that's just going to be my personal opinion. Don't be greedy and stupid, you can wait, you can save, eventually you'll come back home, but if you want to try him yourself, absolutely you have to try him right now, then it is what it is. Nothing else needs to be said. Black hole, 30% rest, boom. And then lastly, for your E6, you will get a 30% crit rate buff as well as a 60% crit damage buff when using your skill ultimate, which pretty much will give rise to your main DPS Welt Yang. I would say purely from crit value alone, this is going to be a solid 9 out of 10 because it is a 120 crit value from an E6. Just purely from like numbers perspective, because it saves you so many substats to actually build your Welt Yang, it becomes incredibly easy to actually use him. And even if you're going to be running him as a sub DPS, it actually opens up the potential for you to run maybe an EHR chest, so you can still maintain a relatively good crit ratio as a sub DPS. But at this point, I would say, you know, if you already have an E6 Welt, I sincerely urge you guys to try to use him as a main DPS. Try some sustainers runs, you will be absolutely shocked at bro's performance. So in summary, for every single one of the 9 changes in Welt Yang, the average rating is going to be a 7.33 out of 10. The most amount of changes I've ever seen in a unit in Novaflare, 0 to hero R moment. I would say, while as impressive as the buffs are, the environment that Welt Yang has at the moment is not particularly favorable for him because no one can actually make use of him effectively unless we get another big boy nihility moment. That being said, Elation as of right now is going to be taking up all of the spotlight, with Break, DOT, and Remembrance falling closer behind, and none of them really wants to run Welt specifically unless you want to do a sustainless Welt Yang run, but it is not going to be recommended for the casual player base who wants to play this game a little bit more chill. For the builds, if you're going to be running a sub DPS, 4-piece Eagle, 2-piece Vulnerable Lushaka for the support, or if you're going to be running main DPS, it's going to be 4-piece Diver or 4-piece Quantum with a 2-piece Routine Arena for the highest possible amount of damage. For both cases, you definitely want to run Welt with Energy Regeneration Rope because he really wants to get ultimate as fast as possible. For the light, you can run Tutorial or Resolution or Cypher S1 for the debuffer, or if you're going to be going for a main DPS, then Aircron S1 is going to be. Then for our teammates, Aircron is pretty much the only Nihility crit DPS that can compete in the meta, using Sparkle for an E2 Aircron or Seerwolf and Jiaoqiu for an E0 Aircron, and then your sustain is pretty much going to be your E0 S1 highest scene. For a main DPS, Ceredra and Sparkle is pretty much almost a must because of the skill point spam. The last slot ideally running sustainless with RMC or Sunday. If you want to run a sustain Welt Yang, then just kindly run Huohuo for the energy regeneration. Now, some other sustainers Welt Yang runs with a E4 plus Welt Yang includes Archer, Aircron, Elation Flagship, and Welt main DPS himself, but he would really benefit a lot from the E4 for the 30% rest down. If you want to run an E0 Welt Yang sustainless, it is going to be more competitive. For example, if you want to use Elation, you could just use EMC and kind of just get a job done at almost the exact same cost, but if you want the highest possible amount of value from a more universal Welt Yang sustainless, then definitely consider thinking about the E4. And then for the cost upgrades, E1 is alright, E4 is absolutely insane, but like I mentioned, never ever chase a standing unit's E4 because it's really, really expensive. And if you're going to be getting E6, enjoy your Welt main DPS or even as a sub DPS to see his damage go up a lot higher. So with that, we're gonna come to the end of our video with a little bit of a tier list, if I can say so myself. The left side over here is gonna be the changes in terms of how big they actually change compared to the old kit, and then the right side tier list is gonna be how they actually perform in the current meta, in my opinion, right? So once again, tier list is gonna be war and whatever. You can kind of say whatever you want. It's fine. This is just gonna be my opinion. But I would say that number one, the most important thing is big changes for unit does not mean they're gonna be performing well in the current meta, right? For example, Welt, Yang, and Seele arguably has the biggest changes. But Firefly objectively just does really, really well, especially with Dahlia in the current environment. You have a lot of shield buffs, you have a lot of break buffs. MiHoYo definitely wants to place quite a bit of favoritism towards Firefly, getting a lot of different break upgrades just specifically for Firefly. And Huohuo itself, we are not going to be seeing that big of a change for sustain, but because of a bit of using her in both DOT as well as the Elation sustain, then Huohuo can also be said to be having a higher meta impact compared to Welt Yang as well as Seele. So I would say overall, this is going to be a very, very nice day for Novaflares. Holding overworking, I'm pretty much going to need a break after this. I still have one more video to finish up on Novi Arbitration, and that's going to be that. Let me know what you guys in the comments below. Word of the day is going to be tier list. Join Twitch, join Discord, use code BOY for 10% off game subs. All the best, and I'll see you guys. Bye bye.